Okay, so thanks so much for giving me the chance to present this paper. So this paper is joint work with Marshall Burke, who's at Stanford, and Ted Miguel, who's at Berkeley. So I want to start by motivating this paper just by noting a stylized but pretty salient fact characterizing African agricultural markets. Actually, Rachel alluded to this fact earlier today, and that's the presence of large and pretty regular fluctuations in the price of staple commodities over the course of the season. So what you see here in this graph is in the periods following, this is for maize prices, I should say, for major markets across East Africa. And what you see happening is in the period following harvest, which is demarcated here in these blue boxes, prices fall pretty precipitously. They then steadily rise through the rest of the season, called the lean season or the hunger season, only to fall again the following harvest. So these fluctuations are large. They're about 25 to 40% on average. Just as a point of comparison, in U.S. corn markets, you see down here on the lower left, prices fluctuate over the season by only about 5% in the U.S. So these are quite large in comparison. And anecdotally, they're much larger in more rural areas. So in our study area in particular, in rural western Kenya, which you see demarcated here in green, prices have fluctuated by about 42 to 125% over the past 5 years. Okay, so we've established that staple food prices are not fixed within the season. Now, in theory, these staple commodities are storable. And so storage should allow the movement of grain intertemporally. And in sort of the simplest of models, an unconstrained intertemporal profit maximizer should store a unit of grain if the discounted expected future price is greater than the price today plus some cost of storage. So you might think that rural households should use storage to buy at a low price and sell at a high price. In fact, it looks like they're doing the exact opposite. So rural households appear to be either selling low after harvest time or buying at a high price later in the lean season, and often they're actually doing both. So selling at a low price right after harvest, running out of their own inventories, and returning to the market as consumers to buy back at a high price during the lean season. So this is some data from our pilot that just shows sort of what's happening here. So in the left-hand graph, you see both mean and median inventories in the weeks post-harvest. You see that inventories are rapidly depleted in the post-harvest period. On the right-hand graph, you see quantities sold minus quantities purchased. So the vast majority of sales are happening in this post-harvest period. That's when prices are lowest. And again, many households return to the market as consumers to buy back at this high price here in the lean season. Okay, so they're selling low and buying high. And in terms of welfare, this is pretty important. So the modal household in our sample appears to be giving up about 1 to 2 months of agricultural wages by engaging in the selling low and buying high behavior instead of the reverse. Okay, so this paper is going to ask, sort of what's going on here that can explain this arbitrage puzzle. Why are farmers not using storage in order to arbitrage these seasonal price fluctuations? And specifically, we're going to explore the most common hypothesis or answer given to us by farmers when we ask them, why are you engaging in this behavior, which is that they're credit constrained. So as farmers say, harvest is a time of high expenditure needs, so many bills come due at harvest time. In particular, school fees are due just in the few weeks after harvest. And as farmers say, in the presence of credit constraints, these high harvest time expenditure needs must be funded by high harvest time sales. So the hypothesis is, in the presence of financial market imperfections, the timing of production and consumption are going to have to be linked in time, or here the timing of expenditure and sales. So that's the hypothesis. We're going to test this hypothesis by randomly offering a loan to farmers given out at harvest time worth about $100. And we're going to see if it's able to enable them to store for longer and to arbitrage these seasonal price gaps. We randomize this loan offer at 2 different levels. So the first level, the loan is randomized across farmers, and that's going to allow us to look at outcomes on an individual level on things like storage, revenues, and consumption. We also randomize the density of this loan across locations, and that's going to allow us to look what happens at a market level on things like prices when we enable more storage in a given area. In terms of data, we collect 3 rounds of high-frequency household surveys collected throughout the year, and we also collect monthly price data at 52 local markets throughout our study area. In terms of timeline, we conduct 2 years of replication. So there's actually an internal replication analysis here in this paper. And we also run a long-run follow-up survey 1 to 2 years after the loan is completed to look for long-run effects or to see if farmers are able to start saving their way out of this credit constraint. Okay, a little bit more about the setting. So this takes place, as I mentioned, in Western Kenya. Our implementing partner is One Acre Fund. They're an agricultural NGO. And we're working with their client farmers who are growing maize on about 2.4 acres of land. That's pretty standard for this part of Kenya, and yielding about 0.8 tons of maize. As I mentioned before, the seasonal price swings have been ranged from 42 to 125%. And just to give you a point of comparison, so the storage costs of storing for this period of 9 months, including post-harvest losses, are only about 6%. Okay, so it seems that there's a large opportunity here for arbitrage. And again, farmers say the reason they're not arbitraging is because of these credit constraints. So we're going to offer them a loan to try to alleviate these credit constraints. A few more details on this loan. So the loan is a group liability loan, and it's offered in this post-harvest period. There's actually some randomized timing of when we offer it exactly that I'm happy to chat about if people are interested in. The loan is collateralized by stored maize. Now, I use quotations here around collateralized because it's not collateral in the true sense of the word. So farmers are simply storing in their homes. One Acre Fund, our NGO partner, doesn't have sort of physical or legal claim over the maize, but it's relevant in that farmers can borrow as a function of the number of bags they have in storage on the day the loan is dispersed. After that, they can do whatever they want with the loan and the bags of maize. The terms are pretty good. So this is a 10%, the loan carries a 10% flat interest rate. And it's very flexible repayment. So the only rule is that farmers have to repay everything within 9 months. Like most microfinance groups, there's this dynamic incentive where if you default on the loan, you get kicked out of One Acre Fund in the future. In practice, default's pretty low, so fewer than 2% of farmers default. And the average loan size, as I mentioned, was about $100 for those who took it up. And take-up is high, so 63% of those who were offered this loan choose to take it up. Quickly, in experimental design, as I mentioned, there are these 2 different levels of randomization. So at the higher level is the sublocation level. A sublocation is about 4 or 5 villages put together. So we randomize sublocations into high and low intensity. What that means in practice is in high intensity sublocations, we sampled 80% of One Acre Fund farmers. In low intensity, we sampled just 40%. Then in the second level of randomization, we randomized farmer groups of about 8 to 10 farmers into treatment and control groups. Okay, so as a result of this randomized saturation design, we have doubled the number of treated farmer groups in high intensity as we do in low. So I want to show you the results at the individual level, but before I do, I first want to just show you for our 3 main outcome variables on inventories, net revenues, and consumption, how these variables, or how these outcomes vary over the course of the season just among the control group. So this is showing you from November, this post-harvest period, out to the end of August, the end of the lean season. So what you see is inventories start off high, they're sort of rapidly depleted, as we showed before. Net revenues, which are the value of sales minus the value of purchases, start off positive. This is the post-harvest period when farmers are selling, later turning negative as they run out of their own maize and go back to the market as consumers. And again, you see some seasonality in household consumption as well. So that's among the control group. How does treatment change these outcomes? Well, the solid line here is the mean among the treated group. So we see a jump in inventories among treated farmers. This sort of dies out by the end of the season as everyone pretty much sells out their full stock by the end of the season. Net revenues are actually initially lower among treated farmers. That's because they're holding off selling their maize. In fact, some are even buying. You see that negative net revenues there in the beginning. But later they jump up above that in the control group as those treated farmers are releasing their stored maize and at a higher price. You see some similar patterns in consumption, but this is not going to quite be significant. Just to show you what is statistically significant, here I'm showing you essentially the same results, but treatment minus control means, as well as the 90 and 95% confidence interval. So you can see this inventory effect is significant for most of the period. Net revenues initially significantly lower, later significantly higher, and again, nothing quite significant happening here on consumption. We can quantify these effects by looking at a pretty simple intention to treat effect, essentially regressing these outcome variables on treatment status. We see overall an increase in inventories. This is about a 25% increase off of the mean. This is most concentrated in this round 1 period, which is the post-harvest period. By the end of round 3, which occurs at the end of the lean season, this has pretty much died out. On net revenues, again, we see this initially negative effect, later positive. In total, the total revenue effect is a positive effect. And just to give you a sense of this magnitude, this is about a 28% return on investment given the size of the loan. And I say this is already taking out the interest rate paid on that loan. Or another way to think of it is an 8% increase in the value of harvest. Nothing quite significant happening here in consumption. This is one of those 30-day recall measures that are sort of notoriously noisy, unfortunately. The point estimates line up in size with the revenue effects, but nothing quite significant there. Okay, so those are the individual level effects. Now let's turn to the market level effects. So by encouraging greater storage, what this loan is doing in practice is shifting supply at different points in the season, and we want to ask, does this affect local market prices? Now note that even being able to detect any effect is going to require two things. So one, there has to be a meaningful shock to local supply, and two, for that shock to local supply to translate into a local price effect, it has to that markets are at least somewhat imperfectly integrated. Otherwise, trade is just going to smooth that supply shock across markets, and we're not going to see any differences in price. Right? So on the first point, in terms of the size of the shock, so we are treating what I would call a small but meaningful percentage of the total population. So we're treating 14% of the population in high saturation areas, 7% in low, and in the paper we actually go into the exact, quantify the exact shift in quantity we think we're inducing. On the second front, in terms of integration, so there's reasons to think these markets might not be perfectly integrated, that there are meaningful transaction costs associated with trade. So sort of most obviously transport costs, there might also be search costs, some of Jenny's work, some of my own work looking at imperfect competition among intermediaries. But frankly, we were pretty agnostic going into this as to whether the level at which we randomized the saturation, the sublocation level, whether markets were how well they were integrated at that level. Okay, so those are the preconditions. Now, if we see effects, what should we expect to see? So in high-intensity areas, as more people are storing and engaging in arbitrage, what we predict is that prices will be higher immediately after harvest, as maize is kept in stores and off of the market, and lower later on as that stored maize is released. So higher post-harvest, lower later on. And that's in fact exactly what we see. So here on the left-hand graph, I'm just showing you the raw mean prices in low and high-intensity markets. On the right-hand graph, I'm showing you the difference between high and low-intensity markets, again with that 90 and 95% confidence interval. So what we see is that prices are significantly higher in this post-harvest period in high-intensity markets. That difference drops over the course of the season such that by the end, prices look like they're lower in those high-intensity markets, although, of course, this is clearly no longer statistically significant. Okay. So significant effects at harvest and sort of the directional effects we'd expect over the entire course of the season. Now, finally, turning to the individual returns again, we want to ask what might these GE effects on local market prices, what might those mean for the individual returns to the loan? So just to sort of summarize the logic here, this loan is designed to enable farmers to arbitrage the seasonal price gaps. In high-intensity markets, we see significantly higher post-harvest prices and perhaps weekly lower lean season prices. And so we want to ask, do these price effects diminish the profitability of storage, right? Do they reduce the benefits to the treated, to borrowers? Now just note, that's the direct effect for borrowers. For non-borrowers, there actually might be some benefits from smoother prices, right? So non-borrowers who are still selling at harvest time and buying back in the lean season, they might actually benefit from smoother prices over the course of the season. So it's essentially a question about spillovers. So to estimate this, we're going to regress those three main outcome variables Y. So it's going to be, again, storage, inventories, revenues, and consumption on, again, a dummy for being treated, but now we're also going to regress this on a dummy for being in a high-intensity sublocation. That's sort of representing the treatment status of others around you and an interaction term. And so now beta 1 is going to tell you the treatment effect on treated individuals in low-intensity areas. Beta 1 plus beta 3 will tell you the treatment effect for treated individuals in high-intensity areas. And beta 2 would tell us that there are any spillover effects to control individuals in high-intensity areas. Okay, so here's what we find. So in inventories, we see not much evidence of heterogeneity. So this point estimate here is very similar to the pooled point estimate. it looks like treated individuals in both high and low intensity are storing more. And just to guide you for this table, so you can read the significance for low intensity treatment effects just off of this beta 1 coefficient. For treatment effects for treated individuals in high intensity areas, you have to add up beta 1 and beta 3. So we're showing you down here the p-value on that joint significance. Okay, so not much heterogeneity by inventories. When we turn to revenues, we see a really different story. So this point estimate here on revenues is much larger. It's actually almost double what we see in the pooled specification. And that's because almost all of the revenue effect that we're seeing from this loan is concentrated among treated individuals in low intensity areas. For treated individuals in high intensity areas, when we add up beta 1 and beta 3, we see still positive point estimate, but much lower, and in fact no longer statistically significant. Okay, so the takeaway, let me just show one more thing actually, which is in terms of spillover effects for non-treated individuals, for non-borrowers in these high intensity areas. So we're seeing no effect on inventories, but suggestive, clearly quite noisy, but potentially suggestive evidence they might be seeing some small bump in revenues, consistent, I should say, in magnitude at least, with some small benefits from smoother prices over the season. Okay, so implications, so we find these revenue effects are concentrated among low-intensity treated individuals. The takeaway is the perhaps obvious one, which is arbitrage is most profitable when you're the only one doing it, right? When others around you start to arbitrage and we see these price effects, it becomes less profitable. Methodologically, we think this is important because it suggests that the impacts that are captured in small pilots might not correspond to impacts at scale. So just note that if we had estimated the direct effects of this credit just among a small number of farmers, we would have really overestimated the direct benefits of this loan. So we would have said, oh, this is a really high return product, when in reality, when done at scale, the returns are much lower. Right? And then finally, we think in the paper a little bit about what implications these G effects might have for the distribution of the gains. We find these small indirect gains per person, small as they may be, are actually accruing to a large number of people. So a lot of folks aren't borrowing and are benefiting from these smoother prices potentially. This could be a large portion of the gains from this loan product. And we calculate according to our point estimates in the previous table that in this context it looks like even though the direct sort of private gains to borrowers are lower at high saturation, there's actually larger social gains at high saturation given these potential indirect benefits. Okay, so just to conclude, so we find that offering farmers harvest time loans relaxing this credit constraint increases their ability to arbitrage these seasonal price gaps. We see significant increases in storage and in revenues. It suggests a role for credit to increase smallholder profitability. And as a result of these findings, One Acre Fund is now scaling this loan product to 70,000 farmers across Kenya. We find at a market level that greater storage results in significantly higher post-harvest prices and perhaps weekly lower lean season prices. We see this as a potentially nice decentralized tool for achieving price stability, which is often a stated goal of governments, but the tool they typically have to achieve this goal is holding public reserves, which can be open to mismanagement, corruption, etc. And then finally, we find that the market level effects are shaping the returns to the loan. So we find specifically the direct revenue gains are concentrated among the treated in low saturation areas. And the sort of general takeaway here is when you're implementing an intervention that's going to shift local supply in an isolated market like the rural markets we're working in, you want to really think about the price feedback and how that might shape those returns. We think this is applications to actually a variety of contexts, including, sort of most obviously agricultural technologies that are shifting the local supply of crops, but perhaps also things like vocational training that are shifting the supply of local skilled labor. These price effects are really important, we think, to measure and try to identify as they seem to shift the overall level and also the distribution of the welfare gains. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much for a very interesting paper. Sparked more questions and areas to develop further. So I'll start with a short summary of what I took away, my understanding of this interesting question. So starting with the original, why are Kenyan farmers not taking advantage of the price fluctuations, and why are we observing this pattern of the instant post-harvest selling at low prices and then 6 to 9 months later buying at high prices? In terms of the summary, what was nice to see was this testing of a microcredit product on specific group of farmers, smallholders, and then the impact across inventory, consumption, and revenue. So getting that range of impact and looking at the potential for variation coming through. Also in terms of the density, high density, low density. So it was a very nice cross-section of the types of potential effects. So what was quite interesting is that your finding of the high loan saturation, so areas with high loan density leading to a diminished revenue. So when, as you concluded there, when lots of people have access to this loan, the space for arbitrage is limited. It's really only beneficial if you are one of the few having access to this loan. And in terms of your methodology, it was quite nice to get a sense of the before and the after, especially in terms of what happens when the loan is no longer available. And this, I thought, was one of the most significant findings, is that there's no structural effect, that once the loan is taken away, the opportunities is taken away, the farmers revert back to original behavior. There's no long-term effect. So in terms of the kinds of contributions, I thought it was very nice, this positioning that you made with regard to the literature, in particular the difference with other studies on microcredit. So this idea that, so you raise 4 points in the paper that perhaps small businesses, so in the other literature, small businesses or potential micro-entrepreneurs perhaps lack the profitable investment opportunities. So clearly that's not the case, that even with storage, and storage is quite a small percentage, so 6%, it seems quite a small proportion, but it still is a good investment opportunity when loans are available. So that's in contrast to other studies. And then the other idea coming through the literature is this notion that perhaps opportunities for investment exist, but there are no skills such as managerial or ability to channel capital into these alternative investments. So that seems to also be if you like, contrasted in your study, and that was a very nice contribution to the literature. You also raise a number of other factors and literature to consider, and I thought these were areas where I would ask further questions. So you mentioned that some of the reasons why farmers are not taking advantage of this arbitrage opportunity include firstly, no means for borrowing, so no formal or any credit access. What they use their revenue from selling their grains instantly for, what came out of your study was the school fees. And you mentioned also that if you change the timing of the school fees, that can affect the behavior. So whether farmers choose to sell instantly, it depends on whether you have to pay the school fees earlier or later. So the timing of school fees changes their behavior. And then you also mentioned that perhaps they're not using this arbitrage opportunity because they don't have information about the price changes. Although that seems to come out that they actually perhaps do, because they seem to be quite aware of that option. So it might be that there's variation across the farmers. It would be interesting to hear more about that. And then what I thought was quite interesting is this idea that perhaps the farmers are impatient, that they are aware of other investment opportunities, are aware of the price fluctuations, are aware of the constraints such as school fees and so on, but have other reasons driving their decisions to sell instantly, and it's a sort of intertemporal choice of choosing to cash in now rather than later. So in terms of the questions, what I would raise for you is what other sources of loans are there? How easy is it to access these? And is there really variation in their access to credit? So not just across farmers, but across the different sites that you covered. So that was part one. And then the second question was, is this just about one crop producers, is it about maize producers, or do they have access to, if you like, cash or liquidity because of diversification strategies? So this was something that came up in an earlier session today, the notion of crop diversification as a way to manage your risk. And then finally, you mentioned this notion that there's no long-run effect, that as soon as the loan is removed. What, in your view, could create such a structural change or such a long-run effect? Is there anything that's coming out where you'd go for further research into that long-run effect? There we go. Thank you very much.
Should I respond to, maybe I'll just respond to a few of these and then we can take other questions if they exist. Can folks hear me? Okay. So in terms of, yeah, thank you. Okay, so in terms of other credit access, so, what's that? Okay, but you can hear me. You can hear me now. Okay. So, in terms of other credit access, yeah. So there is a bit. So I think 8% of our sample has access to formal loans, and 25% have access to sort of informal loans from money lenders, family members, or friends. In terms of the informal loans, so very low formal loan access. In terms of the informal loans, the money lender source is sort of always available, but it's often very high interest rates. So they charge about 20% per month, at least according to farmers in our sample. Friends and family probably charge much less, but I think one of the issues with using those informal sources from family members or friends around this kind of shock is this is an aggregate shock. And so it's difficult to rely on other family members or friends who are also farmers and are facing a similar harvest schedule and school fee schedule and all of that. In terms of other crops and diversifying, yeah, so about 55% of farmers grow other crops. Those tend to be staple crops that don't have the exact same schedule, but they're quite correlated, so they'll grow beans or sweet potatoes that have some similar cycles. About 12% of our sample does grow sugarcane, and that both is not a cyclical crop, so it doesn't have a set harvest schedule, and it's also a cash crop, but there aren't that many. What we see more is that some folks in our sample, about a quarter, have small businesses. They tend to be fairly subsistence level, so pretty small, but they're more active in the lean season, so it looks like they are using that a bit to diversify their income. In terms of the long-run effect, I mean, we're still sort of puzzling over this. I think our hope was that people would start to save their way out of this credit constraint. And actually, it wouldn't take you too long. So if you gave this loan repeatedly for 3 or 4 years, you could actually, and you saved the entirety of the returns from this, you could actually start self-financing this loan. Now, if you actually save at more of the traditional Kenyan savings rate of more like 10%, it's going to take you 35 years. So the question really is sort of why are people not saving? We did actually try to, Pascaline Dupont has this work with John Robinson, showing that if you give these simple metal lock boxes to people, they'll save more for preventative health in their case. And so we actually cross-randomized that in our sample and gave some people access to this lockbox to see if maybe they use this to start saving. It actually looks like they store less when you give that in the lockbox. It may be their alternative sources of savings technologies, but we're still sort of puzzling on that one. I agree, it's a puzzle. But thanks for your comments. Should I take some other questions if there are any? Doug?
So you've got this possibly insignificant finding on consumption, and yet the net revenues are nice. Another alternative explanation besides the measurement problem is that households are saving in other ways, and I wonder if you could think about, I'm sure you've thought about this, but whether possibly what households are doing here is trying to diversify their asset holdings, that actually storing more maize means that literally all of their assets are the same type and they're all subject to the same kind of shocks. And a pretty sensible thing to do might be to diversify by selling some at harvest and putting it into some other kind of asset or off-farm activity.
Yeah, we don't see any change. That's a great question. So we don't see any change in cash savings, but I don't think we've looked, and we do measure things like assets and other things. So we can see if we're seeing, you're thinking some substitution maybe out of other things. So we can look and see that. I think that's a good question.
Okay, I want to drill down a bit on consumption because I really want to understand what is it that you guys tried doing, or whether you could try and do this a bit differently if you went back to the same areas. Because there's a lot of different ways in which you can measure consumption, and I'd just like to understand what the exact concern you have, because those are pretty,
Sure.
precisely.
So we did sort of a 30-day recall period measure, and we asked them about a huge variety of goods they're spending money on, and we also valued some of their home production goods. And it's sort of the total sum of all of that.
Okay, so that will probably not, that is the reason why you're probably not finding anything on the consumption front.
Okay, do you have suggestions about different ways to measure?
I have tons of suggestions on how you can better measure consumption.
Okay,
So
we should chat after. Thanks.
For sure.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone, for sticking it out until the last session of today. I'm Jenny Aker. I'm very excited to be here, and I'm presenting some very preliminary work with Brian Dillon, who's at the University of Washington, which really builds upon Lauren and Marshall and Ted's work, but in a quite different way. And so, you motivated this by saying we're really interested in this issue of when we see this intra-annual price variation ranging from 20 to 60%, we often know that many farmers aren't necessarily taking advantage of this, and the question is really why. Lauren's work was focusing primarily on this credit constraint, and we're going to be focusing primarily on the storage constraint, looking at the case specifically of cowpea in West Africa. And so the reason we really want to do this is to kind of motivate this by saying cowpeas are one of the primary, if not the primary, food and cash crop for millions of farmers in West Africa. It's primarily millet, sorghum, and cowpea in Sahelian West Africa, and Niger, which is one of the poorest countries in the world, is the second largest cowpea producer in the world. 80% of its population grows cowpeas, which is about 16 million people. And so I'm not going to go through all of these graphs because Lauren, I think, nicely showed them for maize prices in East Africa, although kind of these patterns that we see in East Africa for maize are perhaps unsurprisingly also seen for cowpeas in West Africa, where we see this intra-annual price variation ranging from about 20 to 60%. This is a little bit old. And again, kind of although the fact that farmers could potentially engage in intertemporal arbitrage, about 80% of the farmers in our sample are primarily selling in the 2 months immediately after the harvest. And she put forth these kind of potential explanations in terms of credit and storage. We're going to focus primarily on storage, and this is the reason why. So any of you who know cowpea and you want to geek out about cowpeas, it's pretty much kind of a semi-perishable commodity. And semi meaning that it's not going to be completely destroyed right away, but over the course of 9 months, if nothing else is done, it's completely destroyed and it becomes dust. 50% of it would be destroyed within the first 3 months, and by 9 months, it would be completely gone. And obviously, farmers have known about this for centuries, right? So if you talk with farmers who about 200 years ago, what would they do? They would bury it, because what that does is it suffocates the cowpea weevil. Then kind of it's very difficult in terms of burying to get it out and to be able to sell it in the market. There's all these other things that are in your cowpeas. So what do? Well, maybe you're going to be putting it in plastic jugs that you can buy in the market. Maybe you can put it in large-scale containers. You put it in bags and you add in some plastic to suffocate it, or you add in some pesticides. And so obviously all those things are quite effective in terms of getting the storage losses down. They're still significant, right? So I put here a lower bound of about 7% is lost. Lauren had that number in there as well, and I think was saying it's not very high. This is kind of during the time that they're actually storing it, which is about 2 to 3 months, and when it's your only cash crop that you have, that any losses are going to be quite significant. And so one of the things that was put forth in the 2000s was, Purdue University kind of build upon what many farmers were already doing and saying, okay, how can we suffocate these pests, but potentially in a more cost-effective way that doesn't have all of these other detrimental factors? So jugs are kind of quite hard to transport. Insecticides obviously have really negative health consequences. Farmers know all of these types of things. And so what they introduced was this PICS bags, was this Purdue improved crop storage bag, which was basically this bag that had these kind of 3 plastic bags in it. They were hermetically sealed. If you use it correctly, then they're going to be very highly effective at ensuring that the cowpea weevil actually can't live, and then it's completely suffocated. And so losses are almost down to 0. The cost, well, it was originally introduced where it was kind of distributed for free. Now, if you're looking across West Africa, the cost is about $1.50 for a 100 kg bag. that's going to last 3 years. If you compare that to about 50% for a standard bag, but that bag also needs complementary inputs, and that needs to be purchased every single year. So it seems as if you compare them side by side, that kind of, while the upfront cost might be a little bit higher for the PICS bag, as comparing it with the regular bag, it's going to be about the same, if a little bit less, and doesn't necessarily have these other kind of negative effects. Well, one of the puzzles here, though, is that adoption remains pretty low. There was a wide-scale campaign, a wide-scale distribution program across much of Francophone West Africa, introducing these bags for free, but adoption kind of varies quite substantially within countries and across countries. And really kind of the question that we wanted to address here, we weren't really doing any types of interventions, but it was mainly exploratory, was why? And so we're really kind of trying to document kind of these adoption levels and patterns, primarily looking at Niger, looking by region, gender, and a whole other bunch of characteristics as well. And then trying to kind of, again, bring in kind of the supply side factors. So if we're looking at kind of, is the market actually supplying this technology, knowing that the two sides need to be able to learn from each other. And so what we're doing is using kind of a both farmer and a trader survey to understand kind of what their beliefs are about this technology, and also measure an experimental measure of willingness to pay using an incentivized BDM game on both sides of the market, and then kind of documenting some stylized facts about this, and then proposing a model of market emergence that's going to predict these multiple equilibria that we see actually in the data. And so just to kind of briefly go through, we have these two kind of surveys that were done in these three major regions in Niger. All of them are major cowpea producing regions. We went into about 93 villages, looked at male and female farmers, all of whom were pretty much cowpea producers, and then did this household survey in September, which was right before the harvest came in, so we can talk a little bit about what that means for bounds on willingness to pay, and asked a variety of questions about cowpea production, storage techniques, and the amounts that they were actually paying, and then played this incentivized BDM game. We then went in kind of during and immediately after the harvest for traders, looking at the markets where farmers were actually selling their cowpea and also buying their cowpea. It went into about 33 markets. Again, kind of did much of the same exercise with traders as we did with farmers, but we tried to get a lot more information about whether or not traders were also actually supplying these bags on these local markets, to see if we could document some of the heterogeneity and distribution that we had heard about so much before. So just to give you a sense of what this looks like in Niger, because this is going to be important for us, we're going to look at this regional distribution. All the way on the left-hand side is Dosso, which is in the west of the country, and on the right-hand side is Maradi and Zander, which is in the east of the country. Three major cowpea producing zones, and Dosso and Zander are right near Nigeria, but Maradi is a little bit farther north, just to kind of orient ourselves so that we kind of know what areas that we're talking about. So what did we kind of see in terms of some of these characteristics? So, reassuringly, kind of almost all of the farmers in our sample had harvested cowpea in the previous year, which would be relevant for us in terms of storage. There's some kind of differences in the amounts that were actually produced in terms of the kilograms. The highest production was in Dosso with about 250 kilograms per year. The lowest was in Zander with about 75 kilograms. About 85 to 90% of them were storing after the harvest, and as I said previously, it was about for 1 to 2, maybe a maximum of 3 months, and they were storing about half of their cowpea production. Now, if you look at kind of what they were actually doing to store these technologies, well, we see that kind of they were spending about $1.50 on storage technologies in the eastern parts of the country, in Maradi and Zander, and about double that in Dosso, perhaps not surprisingly, given the fact that we saw higher production levels in Dosso. A strong percentage of them were actually selling their cowpea harvest, and they were losing about kind of 7% to pests, whether that was the weevil or rats or other types of things, regardless of whether or not they were using this a storage technology. Now, what did that mean for kind of actual PICS adoption? Well, when we look at kind of how farmers were actually storing this technology, we see that there's a really pretty strong heterogeneity in the types of storage technologies that were used. So the first one I'm going to just be focusing on is this traditional bag, which is usually combined with other things, the pests or other plastics. And we see that those traditional bags are primarily used in the middle of the country, in Maradi, with well over 66%. These kind of jugs that are also quite effective are used primarily in the far east of the country in Zaire. And if you look at this PICS bag, when it was actually introduced, almost all of the adoption for that comes in the west of the country from Doso. About 50% of farmers were storing in these PICS bags, and very little adoption in Maradi and Zaire. Less than kind of 3% in Zaire and about 12% in Maradi. So that's kind of on the farmer side of things. And if we look at what's happening on the trader side of things, again, kind of the traders with whom we were talking, these are primarily cowpea traders, but also some bag sellers. Well over 90% of them were storing, which is what we would expect, and they're kind of storing about 2.5 metric tons, and there's kind of similar across these three regions. So they have obviously kind of demand for different types of storage technologies. And then kind of coinciding with those higher amounts that they're actually storing over time, they're kind of spending a significant amount of money on storage technologies, well over kind of $75 in the far east of the country and almost $100 in the west of the country. Their losses are also higher as compared with farmers, right? So here we see that their losses are about kind of 10 to 26%, again, kind of relatively lower in the west of the country and relatively higher in the east of the country. But when we see kind of, again, what types of technologies that they're using, given the fact that they're storing kind of in greater quantities, they're spending significantly more, they're moving around this commodity throughout the country and also to Nigeria, again, we see kind of that there's a pretty strong heterogeneity of adoption. I'm not going to go through all the technologies, but if we just look at the PICS bag, again, almost all of the adoption of that bag is amongst traders that are in the west of the country in Doso as compared with the east of the country in Maradi and Zaire. So that is also reflected in the incentivized kind of BDM games that we had done. We're looking at willingness to pay, where we see that there are kind of some stark differences, especially for farmers in terms of what they were willing to pay. So here I can go in through the details of this during the Q&A, but basically kind of farmers had the chance to actually purchase a bag at the end of this game. And if you look at these kind of three different curves that are going to be showing at a variety of different prices and kind of the quantity of farmers, we see that kind of at any given price, more farmers in Doso, which are those farmers that are in the far west of the country, are willing to pay for a PICS bag than farmers in either of the other two regions combined. Now, despite the fact that we saw kind of a strong heterogeneity in actual adoption and usage of PICS bags amongst traders, we don't necessarily see that kind of interregional variation in willingness to pay. Except for prices below the current market price, where then kind of more Doso traders are actually willing to pay for the bag. And what we see kind of on the farmer side is that kind of these regional differences persist, even if you control for a variety of different characteristics that could potentially be explaining kind of farmers' willingness to pay for this technology. So the question really is kind of why. And Lauren went into a list before. We could go through kind of all the information constraints and kind of prices compared with other substitutes, present bias, liquidity constraints, and kind of then on the market side, understanding kind of how traders are actually getting access to this technology. The interesting thing here is that if you kind of talk with farmers and traders, as many of these surveys, almost all of the traders know about this technology, so it doesn't seem that's necessarily the binding constraint. And farmers, even in the area that has the lowest rates of adoption of 3%, well over half of them have heard about this technology before. You could say, well, maybe hearing about the technology is not enough. Maybe they really have to kind of know what the potential benefits of the technology are. And as we did that, we also played a game on expected depreciation rates using these different storage technologies. So just a simple bag without any kind of additional components versus adding in pesticides versus using the improved storage technology. And it seems that both on the farmer side and on the trader side, kind of their beliefs about expected depreciation rates are remarkably accurate, right? So I just did the first column, which is going to be Doso, so that they've had a lot more practice with this bag. But even if you're looking at kind of the other two regions where we see that kind of PICS adoption and usage is much lower, kind of their beliefs in terms of what did we actually see in trials in terms of PICS adoption and losses are remarkably accurate, both on the farmer side and on the trader side as well. And then we kind of try to kind of estimate out what the value of traders and farmers' storage losses were using these traditional technologies as compared with kind of using the PICS technology. And again, kind of the PICS technology seems to kind of dominate these traditional storage technologies in terms of the value of these storage losses. So the question is really kind of why. You know, we said that maybe potentially the information constraint isn't something that's going to be behind. It's not their belief about the technology. We didn't really go into so much kind of the idea of these credit constraints, but we could imagine that having to put up $1.60 up front as compared to kind of smaller amounts for every single year could potentially be an issue as well. But we think that kind of one of the things that is really going to be important is the actual just supply of this technology on local markets. And again, kind of mirroring what we saw in terms of the regional disparity in adoption of PICS bags across these three regions, what we see is that in the two regions where adoption is quite low, fewer than kind of 40% of markets actually have this improved storage technology for sale in that market on any given day. And this is also reflected in kind of some recall data as well, whereas in the place where adoption is the highest, where willingness to pay is the highest, unsurprisingly, 95% of the markets there had this technology that was actually available. So kind of what explains kind of this spatial heterogeneity and supply, we go through a bunch of different things in the paper that we're trying to kind of work out a little bit right now with some follow-on work with a randomized control trial on the supply side. But basically it goes back into kind of the way in which these bags were initially introduced into the country, which was through a preferential access to PICS in the early years through an exclusive import contract, even though now imports are now liberalized and they can be brought in through a variety of different importers and from a variety of different producers. It seems as if those kind of initial conditions really allowed supply to come onto these markets, farmers to learn from traders, farmers to get kind of used to using this technology, and so it really allowed this market to emerge. And so in terms of kind of what we're going through in the future is that we're trying to then use kind of what we've observed in this existing data to come up with a model of market emergence where, you know, we know that a new good such as this PICS bag is introduced. Farmers are learning about the bag in terms of their initial technology adoption, and they continue using it, but obviously that requires kind of a sustained supply on local markets in order for that to persist and for the market for these new goods to actually emerge. And so farmers are going to be learned by doing and from each other, from other input sellers, as well as from wholesalers. Sellers are going to be learning from other traders and from farmers as well. And kind of what this model we're hoping will do will be useful in terms of kind of explaining these multiple equilibria that we actually observe and really kind of makes explicit the interaction between the two sides of the market, which I know probably seems like it's self-evident, but if we look at a lot of the literature on technology adoption, a lot of that literature primarily focuses on the demand side and kind of what are the constraints and the barriers to adoption on the demand side. And we hope that kind of by bringing together these two aspects, this can potentially fulfill an existing gap in the literature. So overall, what we see is just basically kind of a strong spatial heterogeneity in adoption of this storage technology by farmers and traders, even after you control for a variety of different characteristics that in theory should be able to kind of explain this. It seems as if the kind of the information side of things in terms of awareness of the technology and misperceptions don't necessarily seem to be a major barrier, but perhaps unsurprisingly, traders exhibit less variation in demand than farmers, and this really seems to be driven obviously by some of these demand side factors, which we don't explore in this present paper in terms of credit and present bias, but we really believe that kind of a strong issue here is kind of the supply that's available in local markets and those initial conditions that allowed the market to actually emerge in the western part of the country as compared to the eastern part of the countries. And we're working on a model now to potentially explain that. So that's it. Thank you.
Great. So thanks so much, Jenny. I think this is, as you said, a really important topic. So there has been a lot of work, especially recently, thinking about the demand side factors that affect technology adoption, and I think the supply side has been sort of surprisingly absent from that debate. So I'm glad that you're bringing that in. I also think, in general, the supply side questions in technology adoption can be difficult to answer because in a lot of places where you see cheaper input prices, those are places that maybe are more remote and have different output prices as well. So I was really excited to hear that you might have some sort of exogenous variation in that initial input supply from this PICS exclusive import contract. I'd love to know more about that. It sounds like you might have sort of a neat instrument that affects input prices and wouldn't otherwise affect output prices. I also think that the presence of both farmer and trader data is pretty neat. And you also, I don't think you described as much in this presentation, but in the paper you also have not only traders' demand, but also the demand they expect from farmers. I think that's pretty unique data, so I'm excited to see what you do with that. And I have a few ideas that we can chat about afterwards of additional things you could do, but just as one example, if you know the shape of demand and the type of conduct in the market, so if you think traders are interacting in some Cournot-style fashion and you know the numbers, you can actually back out costs, which I think might be useful if you're thinking about supply-side constraints. So a few just quick suggestions. I mean, you're still developing the model, so this is, I don't know how useful it is at this point, but it'd be nice once you do to sort of lay out the primitives of the model. It sounds like you're saying sort of supply is a function of demand or perceived demand, and I just wasn't sure if you meant like the actual supply curve is a function of demand, or of course, where the intersect's going to be a function of demand. Just sort of laying out what are the primitives in that model. I suspect there's also learning models of dynamic demand, either from the IO or marketing literature. That could be quite relevant there. Related to that, it sounds like you could benefit either from some panel or retrospective data. Getting a sense of people who switch in and out of this technology could potentially be useful. And it also wasn't clear to me if misconceptions are an important part of your story. So you had gotten both actual farmer demand and trader perception of farmer demand, and I wasn't sure if there's something in particular there that you think is going on in terms of trader misconception about demand, and if there's learning on the trader side as well. The final thing is, eventually I think it looks like you've got 3 different regions where you've got these different equilibria, as you mentioned. I think, you're going to be able to come up with a model that is suggestive of why you might see differences there, but of course, with an N of 3, it's going to be difficult to definitively say for sure, but you do have a larger number, I think, of markets or villages, and so as you dig into your model and set that up, thinking about ways to get predictions at a lower geographic level could be useful just in terms of power. Okay. Thanks very much.
I don't have any comments. I agree with all of those. So. Thank you. Yes, I mean, those are things that we're all working on, so thank you. Any other thoughts? Yes,
This is just a factual kind of farming systems question, but what do farmers do with spoiled cowpea? Do they feed it to animals? Because sometimes that's a useful source of chicken feed or other stuff.
To my knowledge, no. I mean, I think once it's done, it's pretty much done. I don't think it's used, but that would be something that we would have to check. But I actually don't know. I don't think so, but I don't know.
Thank you for the opportunity to present. It's actually really exciting. And, well, this paper changed quite a lot between October and now. So it started off being a very nice contained piece of work about regional industrialization and regional collaborative actions in production. And as I've moved into the next phase of research, it's now become about, well, what was the scope for regional industrialization across South Africa, Zambia, and Zimbabwe in soy beans. So what's going around is soy beans, and the grainy stuff is the processed soybeans, which is then going to animal feed producers. So what you're getting here is what I found out in the first part, as well as the kinds of questions that are coming out of the second phase of fieldwork, which is now going forward. So broadly speaking, I'm looking at this question of industrialization coming from a structuralist perspective, and I thought I'd test it all out. So I've gone for the non-quantitative political economy question of why there is such poor evidence or very little evidence of regional collaboration when there's so much rhetoric around how this is great. There could be a shared market, there could be movement of products, but also of labor. There could be a kind of development of a mini region in order to effectively import, substitute, protect this region, help develop domestic, when I say region, I mean cross-border production, and try and develop this in advance and also in contrast to the dominant global players, which are Latin American, North American producers of soy. So it's coming out as this big question of why we're not seeing evidence of this kind of agro-processing becoming embedded, and whether this is, or why this is not really leading to the kind of structuralist self-sustaining industrialization. And I don't have any M&Ms, but when you eat M&Ms or Kit Kats, that's the kind of thing you're eating. You have byproduct of soy. It's lecithin, and almost all chocolate products contain that. The chicken we ate today most probably was also fed soy because of the high protein content. So we all come into contact with this on a regular basis. So the starting framework was this global value chain framework. Do we see upgrading, so moving from the low value added to the high value added? Do we see an opening into new markets? And the expectation within the literature is that this is going to be good because we're moving to the more competitive production, the higher value added, but also that it will generate opportunities for diversification. So it's not just animal feed, but you can make chocolate, other food products, but paint, cosmetics contain soy, all sorts of opportunities for diversification. And I'm looking at South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, primarily because the dominant demand chain is in animal feed, but there's a lot of talk of this diversification. And then there's, of course, the employment story. So agriculture employment is a very large proportion of employment, and there's this rhetoric around the potential positive effects of increased employment. In a recent framework put forward by FAO and UNIDO, they note this idea that agro-processing or agribusiness, so this gray line that we see moving, not working, there, that's better, offers some kind of opportunities or optimism for growth, whereas traditional agriculture, this darker line, shows us a decline. So this idea that if we're going to grow an economy based on agriculture, it needs to have some element of higher value added. So this is the kind of thinking. And then this is in stark contrast with what's happening in agricultural employment. So this is data from OIA 2012, where if you look at the contribution to agriculture employment, it's quite a sharp decline, as well as contribution to GDP. So we have this contrast, or this contradiction between the proposed potential optimism of employment growth, but through agro-processing, so through this kind of value chain upgrading notion, and how this is going to create first input-output linkages, and then ideally spill over into the other kinds of linkages put forward by the structuralists, so whether it's consumption linkages through employment or technology, fiscal linkages, other linkages put forward by Hirschman, Kaldor, etc. So that's the sort of starting point. And then what we get by observing, and what we've done is qualitative interviews to get a sense of the perceptions of policymakers, of processors, of producers, of the key actors in this industry. What do they think is a source of optimism? Is there scope for this kind of regional industrial development? Is there scope for even agro-processing, so value chain development? And we get a very standard story of demand growth, middle classes becoming wealthier, shifting their consumption to animal-based protein from vegetable grain-based protein. And we get a pull effect also from prices. So soy prices fluctuate very heavily because they connect to global, so Chicago prices. So it's the commodity price fluctuation that's driving movements in prices as well. So some of these I've already mentioned. The two main products that come out of soy, the bean that's going around, are the animal feed, so the grainy parts, and the second product, which is about 15% of the output, is soy oil. So the drive effect, the demand pull, is in this soy animal feed, and you can have different types. You can have full-fat animal feed, or you can extract more of the oil. You have reduced-fat animal feed, but the idea is the same. There are two parts of this chain. The soy oil has a very limited market in these countries. So there's a variation in taste. In South Africa, there's very little taste for cooking with soy oil. There's a little bit more of taste in cooking with soy oil in Zimbabwe. So most of the oil seems to leak across the border from South Africa to Zimbabwe and from Zambia to Zimbabwe. as well as Zimbabwe's own production. But there is very little or virtually no export out of that region, so there isn't an ability to shift into new markets, for example, the Asian markets, where there is a stronger taste for using this soy oil directly, or into other markets where there is already the diversified production, so where you can make paints or cosmetics, foods, soaps, other products. These are not really in place in this sub-region. So from the demand side, we see two drivers, the middle class effect, the price effect, and then we see a production increase, especially in Zambia and in South Africa. Zimbabwe's, I'm actually not going to talk about that because there's the whole political economy story around the political regime. There is a separate story about that, but we can leave that to question and answer. We see a very strong supply response, in particular in Zambia. And it's interesting because it's different. So South Africa is primarily large-scale commercial farmers. And the map that you see here gives you a sense of the soil quality. So the soil quality is quite poor in South Africa, but they compensate by having access to credit, good infrastructure, fertilizer, inoculants, and large-scale mechanized farming. In Zambia, it's primarily, so you can see where the green area starts, you get the better soil quality, mostly rainfall, irrigation, good soil quality, and a range of different types of producers, so small, medium, and some large-scale farmers as well. All of these countries have this kind of rhetoric of how regional collaboration, regional industrialization is good, we need to work on a regional market, and all of them, on their own, have invested in shifting their own national production up market into higher value-added processing. So they've all invested in processing, and part of this came out of a previous set of value chain studies identifying processing as a big bottleneck. There's no point increasing production of soy if you can't process it. So there's been state-led as well as private-led investment into increasing processing to the point where there's now excess processing capacity. And despite the increases in production of soy, it's not really creating enough of a pull effect to use up this excess processing capacity. And so there's this kind of dichotomy in the sense that they're saying we'd like regional development, collaboration, and we want to develop a regional market of production, but also of shared supply and shared demand. But this is not happening. This is evidenced by the kind of own investment into increased processing. So there are parallels with the global trends. So this just gives you a sense of where it's going globally, but you can also see that Africa is a very small proportion of the global market. So despite these investments into processing, despite this demand pool, this is not going into the global market. This is not being exported. At the moment, there's very little imports, except of the imports of the raw materials into South Africa, given that they can't produce enough related to that poor soil quality. So this global value chain story is not borne out in the sense that there is no way for these countries individually to access this global market. This is already dominated primarily by Brazil and Argentina producers. Developing an individual national markets or even developing domestic market isn't going to be driven by exports. It's going to be only sustainable if it's for that region's own consumption. But there's no evidence of that collaboration taking place. This gives you a sense of where the demand pull is coming from and gives you a sense of the different responses. So if you, data is really hard to come by, so you can see it's quite patchy, but we can see that for Zambia, the growth effect in poultry feed, which is the main animal feed, is much, much stronger than for South Africa. But then we have a power dynamics coming through here because most of the poultry companies, it's very concentrated, are South African. So these tensions building up between the countries in terms of wanting to be their own producer in their own countries, wanting to move into the higher valued part of the chain, but then the material realities coming forth. South Africa has the resources to have the poultry, have the animal feed, have the fertilizer, have the ports. And so the kinds of ways in which this kind of mistrust or this tension is coming through is through export bans. So Zambia has implemented an export ban. They've also implemented a GM ban. So we'd love to trade with you, we'd love to interact with you, but we will only deal with non-genetically modified soy, and South Africa grows genetically modified soy. So you start to get a sense of the kind of ways in which this tension is being played out. Okay, that's just the growth of global production. I might come back to that later. So this supply response is quite surprising in that, so painted this picture of this tension, each country wanted to grow their own domestic value chain, but there are differences in their ability to respond to this demand. And it's very interesting that Zambia, with its small-scale farming, with its dominance of lack of access to credit, lack of access to even collateral to raise credit, so many of the smallholder farmers do not own their own land, has been able to scale up its production, and the scaling up is in particular with the smallholder farmers. So this is quite phenomenal. They're able to increase production with very little resources, with the constraints that are much, much higher than the large-scale commercial farmers in South Africa. And so although this is only up to 2010, we then did interviews and found that the production increase is even higher after 2010 and is much, much faster growth than, for example, in South Africa. So the figures are not directly comparable. These are areas harvested, so you're looking at the blue, the light blue line. Take note that up to 2015, it's the real figures, sorry, 2014, thereafter it's a projection. But even if you look at the first half of this graph, we can see there's growth, and the volumes are much higher, but the growth is much faster, and it's much more surprising given it's coming from smallholder farmers in Zambia. Zimbabwe, the story is much more volatile. We'll come back to that later. So the other notable difference that's coming through is the ability to produce at low cost. So this gives you the sense of production costs, and we can see that, so for 2010, the cost for leaving farm gate was $350. When we interviewed people in 2014 and again in 2016, the price was actually at $250 for the best producers, averaging at $300. So they're very competitive in that region, and they're very competitive when you compare it to the cost of landed imports. So there's very little imports into Zambia, but most of the imports are into South Africa, and you could see there's potential for Zambian producers to be competitive, even if they transported over land, $100, $63 to cross the border through Zimbabwe, and yet it would still be competitive. But there's the export ban, and then there's the GM story. So there's scope for this regional market to develop from the price or cost of production perspective, and there's scope for it to develop given that there is no space for competing out of that region, for going into the global value chain. There's space for being able to develop these industries is really in the regional sphere. A similar story comes out of the yield. So Zambian, remember these are the smallholder farmers, are able to produce a higher yield. Part of this is the soil quality, these are 2010 figures. When we interviewed again in 2014 and 2016, the yields had improved much more in Zambia than in South Africa. And that was the same for commercial as well as for smallholder farmers. And at the very bottom, just for point of comparison, you see what is the Argentina average yield, 3.4. So you can see that it could be globally competitive, could very well be regionally competitive, but that's not happening. So that just gives you some of the idea. So if you take note of the Zambia 2.6 yield here for commercial farmers, the Zambian yield has improved a little bit by 2000. This is 2015, and the same story also for South Africa. So the best yields are coming out much, much higher. So you can see this story of trying to compete within your own national borders. So the last area I want to talk to you about is this policy investment and into processing and the kind of competition and the overcapacity, and what does this mean? So each of the countries invested into increasing processing capacity, and you can see South Africa dominates. They had in 2012, at the very start of the government investment, the highest capacity. They projected increase, over doubling that from 600,000 tons per year to 1.5 million. It's not quite there, so recent reports are suggesting it's slightly under 1 million tons per year, but it's still very strong. But it's not creating the kind of demand pull for farmers to switch into or be able to match that with enough supply. And the story continues to be one of excess capacity for processing. So what comes out of this in conclusion is this idea that they're all driven by price growth. There's very little regulation. There are no real restrictions for producers, for processors, and there's very little export even across these two countries. And when you speak to processors, they say, where do you buy your grains? So South African processor will say, well, we'd rather buy it from Argentina because it's quicker and easier. We think the quality is better. But actually, this is a perception. There's no real evidence of difference in quality, and there's definitely evidence that you could bring it in cheaper if it was just about price, and that's what they say it is about. And so what this reveals is that there's tension between the countries. There's tension also between producers and processors. So part of the lack of the excess processing capacity comes out of the fact that the producers don't trust the processors. It's very concentrated. They were the ones who received the government money, whereas the producers are struggling with the actual farming cycle, and in particular the smallholders farmers are struggling. So we get this story of very little regional collaboration, very little evidence of upgrading, except if you tick the boxes of, yes, we invested in processing, but it's not changing this change. It's not really shifting the focus onto the higher value-added end. And there's no evidence of this being competitive outside. They will not be able to compete on exports outside this region. So this was where it kind of ended, and I thought, right, okay, so we have a story about regional industrialization. We're not getting these kind of linkages even within the global value chain, input-output chain, let alone outside. And this was actually one of my students who spotted this, so showing them pictures of, so this is one of the new sites of investment, so a brand new processor extracting the oil and generating. So the samples that were going around came from this site. And this is another picture of how they manage it, another site. And what emerged very quickly is that when we think about industrialization and this original story of what is the optimism around agro-processing, development agriculture, it centers around this notion of creation of employment. And this aspect is entirely missing. So if you look at, when you walk around these processing sites, there are 1 or 2 or 3 people. They sit in front of a computer watching this screen. There is very little or no employment generation at this level. So when we interviewed the processors, obviously they won't release employment statistics, but we asked them a kind of ballpark figure. Are you bringing new people in? Who works for you? What kinds of roles do you have? And they're like, well, here they are. You know, this is our technical support. This is the person who runs the maintenance. Here's our IT support. So we're missing this employment story, and there is no scope for this industrialization at a broader level, let alone for the development of that more narrow value chain, if there's no employment effect. So that original side of the optimism coming out of this agro-processing is not borne out because this is an entire elephant in the room, the missing employment. And because the focus of the producers making decisions about what to grow, the processors making decisions about what grains, so it's not just soy, but they look at sunflower, cottonseed, so there's competition at that level. The focus is on the price, and the price fluctuates at very short intervals, and so that there is no space to grow this industry because it's a very short-term focus as a result. And so despite this great optimism that's coming out of the demand pool, the higher price, and the initial switch and the ability to scale up production, we're not seeing this as something that could be sustained over long periods. So where this is going next then is to look at the 2 other areas where we could see potential for, if you like, consolidation. One is what happens at the farm level. Are we seeing farmers, or do they switch in and out of soy, or is it growing area? And what is the story there with the employment based on the knowledge that most of the employment growth would be agricultural wage employment rather than growth of number of farms. And then the byproduct, the soy oils, if you don't have a real market within this region for the soy oil, where would it come out of one of these? So the recent rhetoric in the policy spheres is around biofuel. That could be the kind of non-sensitive space where they may be able to collaborate across borders, given that none of the countries has a biofuel industry in place. So these are the two areas that we're looking at next. So I've actually just come back from interviews on the biofuel. Sadly, the picture doesn't look that much more optimistic there either, because there's competition with the oil industry. And so there's a kind of lobbying sort of political settlement lobbying going on through there. But that's the next phase of research. So thank you for your attention. And there is the full value chain from the beans to, this is the oil, and that's the lecithin that you get in your chocolates and your cosmetics. Thank you very much.
So thanks for the opportunity to read this. I learned a lot. I have not worked in soybean production or processing for a really long time, since when I worked in Ghana. And I think that I just want to start off by saying that you have an amazing amount of data and an amazing amount of references here, which is really useful, and kind of you put everything together in a very nice way. And I also thought that the literature review was pretty astounding. And so as you're thinking a little bit about kind of going on to these next phases, though, I feel like your story is a story of unrealized potential, right? So you started off by telling us about kind of increasing demand for chickens and soy byproducts, and the fact that in these three countries, there's these unique opportunities from a, production standpoint to actually produce soybeans, and the costs are quite low, the yields are actually potentially quite high, but we don't necessarily see it reaching its actual potential. And I think that there's a lot more that you can kind of do with the data that you have to potentially kind of help explain why we haven't necessarily seen this market evolve. And you mentioned a few of these things in terms of kind of the export ban and kind of the GMO ban. But what I'd like to suggest is maybe if you take some of that existing data, given the fact that you have it across several different countries for a really long time span, I think there's some really cool stuff that you could do that I'd like to suggest. And the first one is I would love just to see kind of the dispersion of prices for soybean and soybean products across these three countries over time. So if we think that these markets are kind of whether or not they're functioning optimally, are there kind of these opportunities to spatial arbitrage within these countries and across these countries, you have all the data that are there going back a really long time. And then there might be some really interesting kind of exogenous variation when you've talked about kind of shocks or things that have happened in Zimbabwe or this export ban or this GMO ban. And I think that that could actually be quite powerful to say, within kind of this area of Southern Africa, are there kind of potential opportunities and gains from trade? And that could be something that I think that could be very easily that would be done. And then building onto that, as I said before, then you might kind of get some information about kind of how this exogenous variation is not only affecting kind of the functioning of these markets over space and over time, but then how that affects kind of farmers' decisions to invest in soybean production. So is this something that farmers go in and out of quite frequently because prices go up and then prices go down, or is it something that they have these sustained production? In Zambia, it suggests that kind of they're staying within soybean production and they're continuing to invest, but it's just not, it's hard to know whether or not kind of, if we're looking at the intensive and extensive margin of farmers who are actually engaging in soybean production, whether or not that's changing quite substantially, and whether or not that's changing with respect to prices and also other types of policy. The second thing that I would also love to see that you talked a little bit at the end was, kind of their competition on international markets. And again, given kind of the rich data that you have, I'm wondering if you could literally look at kind of pass-through of prices from international soybean markets and how this is or isn't passed through kind of to these local markets. And again, how responsive are they to these international changes in prices? And I think that if you were able to add those kind of 2 or 3 things onto this paper, that would really go a long way in terms of kind of explaining why this potential exists and showing us that it exists, and that, you know, it's not necessarily being realized because of X, Y, and Z, which you go into a little bit of the political economy and a little bit of kind of the export bans. But I enjoyed reading it, and I think that that's really interesting. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So excellent point about the correlation of the prices. I do agree. I have actually got some data on that, but I thought it was too much. It was already quite a lot. But the prices for Chicago soy, which set the benchmark, and for Zambia and for the prices in Johannesburg are on par region. And it's done on purpose, so they keep the South African price locked in. And the South African price also dictates what happens with the Zambian price and Zimbabwean price. So they're correlating very closely.
Okay.
But actually that then comes back to this idea that the South African processors don't care as long as it's cheap, but they do care because they want to prioritize imported soy. And so they will make sure that they are able to bring it in cheaper for ongoing explanation that this is cheaper. This is a bit of a tough slot. It's the end of the day.
I have one question, which is, how much do you know about, you talked a little bit about regional integration. Is there, do you know much about smuggling? Sort of illicit trade across borders?
Only anecdotal evidence. So the border is actually very porous. So officially there's the GM ban. And so South Africa cannot export to Zambia or Zimbabwe, but there is no real market for soy oil, so all the soy oil, almost all of it, leaves South Africa to go to Zimbabwe and gets blended, and therefore you can't tell where it's coming from, but almost all of it goes to Zimbabwe. There were some stories when we were doing the fieldwork where the Zambian border was shut for soy trucks coming across into Zimbabwe, so the Zambian excess goes into Zimbabwe, and then there were some stories of some trucks being held back, and it took a few weeks, and then the border for those trucks was opened again. So the border is very porous, and even the South African processors basically said, oh, no, we buy it all imported. And then when you talk to the people at the processing plant, they say, oh, if we have shortage and we need to run full capacity on our processing factory, or we'll bring it in from anywhere, including Zambia, including Zimbabwe, we just buy it in, and nobody checks exactly. So it's very porous. I don't think you even need to smuggle, you just drive it over the border. Or even mislabel or other forms of smuggling. So there is regional collaboration, but it's very small scale in that whole.
Just a comment, really, that I think looking at soy processing for employment generation, it's hard to think of an agro-processing subsector less likely to find employment generation. Relative to the horticultural processing over time, picked in some sense the agro-processing sector least likely to generate employment effects. I wouldn't want to generalize from that to a broader statement about agro-processing as a potential sector for employment growth. So I think it's probably overstated in general. But along with sugar and think of 2 or 3 other commodities that have similar low employment industries, industrial processing. There would be other things,
That's a very good point. I think that was more in response to the policy rhetoric that was going around saying anything to do with developing agriculture is great. Agriculture is a new, agro-industrialization is a new fashion in the policy rhetoric, and part of this is, oh, it's got to be good for employment. And actually that it's most of the growth areas, at least in South Africa, in agricultural, processed agriculture, are not generating employment. So So there isn't the polyester in other commodities either. Shall we call it a day? Thank you very much for your participation.